no regrets, no confusion. There'll be no pollution. I'm so thankful I've decided to change my ways.
Welcome back to the Leaving Eden podcast. We are your hosts, Sadie Carpenter, cult expert, cult survivor. Sadie Carpenter is here with you as always.
As most of the time.
Most of the time. Lately,
this
you've
last
been,
month. As always now, going forward.
I'm Gabriel Hacohen. Are you excited to finish up for now our Revelation, End Times, and the Rapture and the End of Days episode series? Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you said finish up for now, because I think we're starting to realize there's no way we could have hit this all, even in a very extended series, but we've gotten to most of what we wanted to get to, and we can revisit this in the future.
Yeah, and the thing that I guess I kind of sort of had some idea of this going into this section, this episode series that we're doing, is that the book of Revelation and the ideas about the rapture, the end times, all of that, all of the prophecy stuff is kind of one of the things that makes American evangelicals and fundamentalism so weird. But just how much of the stuff that we see today, that we see, oh, that is some evangelical or that is some fundy stuff, is so heavily based just on this book and just on the eschatology alone.
Yeah, and then the way that is interpreted ties in with biblical literalism, which ties in with the fundamentals. I think we've really started to see how the belief in Revelation fits into the web of evangelicalism. It's not just an accessory. It's not just this outside thing.
Yeah, and so for that reason, I think it's impossible for us to not come back and revisit this topic in great detail later, and it'll allow us to, I think, maybe explore some more niche aspects of it, which might be fun, possibly less triggering for some people, which is the hope. Today's episode, we're actually going to start, we've done some deconstruction on the side when we've gone through the sort of biblical narrative of what happens in the book of Revelation. Now we're going to go in and talk about where do these ideas come from? When did this start to be a mainstream part of American evangelicalism? We're going to look at the history. We're going to look at some possibly alternate theories as well.
We are going to tie up some of the loose ends that we have found along our journey through Revelation and put it to bed for the time being until we revisit it at a later time.
Yeah, I think we might do a few more later in the summer, but for now, I guess next week we're going to be getting into Pride Month, which should be fun. So that's I think much more fun than this. But before we get into that, the Leaving Eden podcast is the podcast about my BFF and co-host, cult expert, cult survivor, Sadie Carpenter's life in and escape from the independent fundamental Baptist cult, the cult in which she was raised. We talk about this cult. We talk about other cults. We talk about religion. We talk about fundamentalism. We talk about the real and present threat that cults and cult ideologies pose to society as a whole. And it is our goal to promote freedom of mind, freedom of thought, and freedom of religion. So if you like our show, if you are a fan of our show, then there's some things that you can do to help support us. You can join our Patreon, patreon.com/Leaving Eden podcast, where you can find extended, uncensored, ad-free versions of most of our episodes, including this one. Yay! If you want to hear us talk about this stuff for even longer, then you can go and find that on our Patreon. Woohoo! Yeah, you can join our Facebook group and our subreddit, which is, both of those places are called Eden Exodus. Eden like the Garden of Eden, Exodus like you're leaving, Eden like our podcast name. Yay, Eden Exodus. And you can check out our merch shop. We've got some Pride Month designs up available now in the merch shop for you to purchase, possibly to wear to your local Pride festival. Proceeds from these sales of this merchandise are going to go support an LGBTQ plus charity that we haven't decided what it is yet, but we're going to do that because we do that every year.
I don't know what we're going to do this year. In the past, we've supported the Howard Brown Health Center and we have supported Point of Pride, which are both incredible charities.
Yeah, I think healthcare is probably the number one place where the dollars are your money goes the furthest if you're contributing to healthcare, I think, is the impression that I've gotten. If you have a Rapture trauma, which is, I take it, a lot of you, if you want to send us your story of Rapture trauma, send it to leavingedenpod@gmail.com. And we're going to read out those stories on an episode and try to, we'll do some serious ones. We'll try to do some lighthearted ones. But if you have some story about overcoming Rapture trauma, then that would be good too. You can also, if you have a Pride story, you can share that to our email as well. And we would love to be able to read that on the podcast during Pride Month. We try to do as many of those stories as we can fit in. We've gotten 1 or 2, I think, so far this year, but we would like to get maybe 4, 5, 6, 7, a dozen. Who knows? That would be awesome. Sadie, do you want to thank our patrons?
I always want to thank our patrons. Our I Gave It All to Your patrons are I'm Not 1010, Kathleen Moncrief, Melissa Manown, Melora King, and Todd Dale on behalf of his spouse, Madeline Antrim. Thank you so much to the I Gave It All to Your patrons.
Yes, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Our Faith Promise Missions tier patrons are Alex P., Allie Allen, Autumn of Our Discontent, Brittany, Chrissa Walker, Dora J., Eleanor Donahue, Hannah Ross, Hannah Montana, Hope Norum, Horton Here's a Shane, Janine Callan, Jana Connor, Jay Nichols, Jen Kaharski, Jessica Tambo, Jonna, Judy B. Jones, and B stands for Body Yaddy Yaddy, Kat Henwood, Kate Terwee, Kristen Marie, Learned Vixen, Linda Morgan, Madeline Antrim, Madeline Cusick, Maddie the Seventh Day Badventist, Marlena Stoop, Mary Martin, Megan Arndt, Morgan, Rob the Methodist, Stephanie Johnson, Steve and Amy, Susie, Tara McNamara, Wes the Cowboy, and Zoe Shuck.
Thank you guys so much for subscribing to our Faith Promise Missions and I Gave It All tier of our Patreon. We would not be able to do this show without you. Thank you guys so much.
Yes, thank you, thank you, thank you. And thank you to everybody who supports us financially over on Patreon and people who support us in other ways, like following us and interacting with our social media and sharing us on social media and recommending us to friends and family and talking about us in real life. All of that gives us the ability to make this show what we want to make it. So thank you.
Absolutely. And I guess we'll just do the TW and be on our way.
In general, we talk about a lot of potentially triggering topics on this show, including but not limited to suicide and mental health, racism, misogyny, PTSD and PTSD symptoms, child abuse, mental, physical, and sexual abuse, and spiritual abuse, including guilt, shame, and fear. In most episodes, we will mention at least a few of these topics, but we try to avoid any graphic detail unless it's absolutely necessary to the story that we're telling, and we do our best to give the audience a heads up if we are going to go into detail on any of these topics.
So at the end of the last episode, after picking apart the text, we were looking at the book of Revelation. We were looking at Thessalonians. We were looking at the Olivet Discourse. We found scant evidence of an actual rapture. And if it exists, it is almost certainly not a pre-tribulation rapture in the way that the IFB say that it is. We've talked about how many denominations of Christianity, particularly Catholic, Lutheran, Orthodox, Reformed, like the high church denominations, hold more of a preterist or a historicist view of the book of Revelation, which don't necessarily include a rapture as part of the doctrine. Having done research on the Puritans and colonial America, I don't see that there's a rapture belief with them either. And having spoken to people who are Christian but not like American or part of the Anglosphere, this rapture belief is almost non-existent for them. So my question is, when and where did the belief in the rapture originate?
So to answer that question, you really need to talk about two different people, one Brit and one American. The Brit is John Nelson Darby, and the American is William Miller. So Darby was responsible for popularizing the belief of dispensationalism. He didn't invent the basic idea that God relates or related to humanity differently during different historical times, but Darby codified it. He absolutely made it what it is now. Dispensationalism is one way of reconciling a very literal salvation message with a literal reading of the Old Testament and a literal futurist view of Revelation. If you need to make this present time that we live in and the Old Testament and Revelation all work together and be literal, dispensationalism is the system that you need to make those things all work together. So dispensationalism teaches that right now, in what most people would call the church age, you have to believe on Jesus and ask him to save you, and that's how you become saved. And then you're once saved, always saved. But what about the people who died millennia before Jesus was born? Well, those people who lived before God gave Moses the law were saved by their conscience, by trying to be a good person and connecting with God by following natural laws of good and bad. Things like don't murder people and don't take what isn't yours. Things that dispensationalists theorize we all kind of know in our hearts to be good and bad. People who lived after the giving of the law, but before Jesus, were saved by following the law of Moses. And then people who live after Jesus is coming are saved by believing in Jesus. That's the basic idea of dispensationalism, because people who need the Old Testament to be literal and about Jesus have to figure out why, like, Abraham and Moses aren't in hell. That's kind of a sticking point. So that's what dispensationalism does. Historical side note, one giant figure in early dispensationalism was a friend of Darby's, Robert Anderson. Robert Anderson was the assistant commissioner at the London Metropolitan Police, otherwise known as Scotland Yard, at the time of the Jack the Ripper killings.
Wow.
Yeah, Anderson was the guy in charge of investigating Jack the Ripper. And when he was, like, not working on trying to catch Jack the Ripper, he was writing about dispensationalism. Just weird coincidence.
I wonder what was less successful, him catching Jack the Ripper or his being able to accurately predict what gets people into heaven.
I mean, he did not catch Jack
the Ripper, and we don't know whether or not dispensationalism is true because none of us have died.
Yeah, so he might be batting 0 for 2.
But there's like a 0.01% chance that...
Yeah. Anderson was published in the Fundamentals, weirdly not about dispensationalism, but it's still important to note that Anderson was an influential fundamentalist theologian at the time, and dispensationalism was an idea that was floating vaguely around for centuries, but Darby is the guy who grabbed onto it and put it in a form that made sense to other people and promoted it. And then other people like Robert Anderson jumped on that train with Darby and also promoted his ideas about the specifics of how dispensationalism worked. Just like that, the idea of a rapture was floating around for centuries. I've dug into later in this episode whether the early church believed in a rapture. Mainstream Christians have pretty much always believed that Jesus was going to come back. But the idea of a pre-tribulation rapture, where Jesus comes back before the tribulation and all the saved people are zoomed up into heaven while the unrighteous stay here to suffer, that came into the modern consciousness because of William Miller.
So William Miller was a Baptist preacher who was active and influential during the Second Great Awakening and was one of the first of many prominent preachers who tried to predict a second advent or the second coming of Jesus to earth. Miller's father was a veteran of the American Revolution, and Miller himself served in the army during the War of 1812. Following the war, he became involved with a local Baptist church in Pulteney, Vermont, which is right on the border with Vermont in upstate New York. During this time, deism was popular in America, and deism is sort of like a monotheistic spirituality that believes in the God of the Bible but rejects the Bible as a divine revelation. And it instead focuses on like rationality, philosophy, things like that. I think of it almost as like post-Christianity. Do you feel like that's...
Yeah, that totally makes sense.
Like many of the founding fathers, including George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, James Monroe, they were all deists.
Well, you know about the Jefferson translation of the Bible.
I know that he tried to translate the Bible and low-key take God out of it. Very weird thing to do, very interesting thing to do.
Yeah, the way that I've heard it described, and I have not read the Jefferson Bible, but Thomas Jefferson retranslated the Bible to take out miracles and the supernatural. Not necessarily the existence of a God, but any interference of that God upon human affairs.
Put a pin in that thought because that might come back later.
Ooh.
Many of William Miller's friends were deists, and so in order to prove to them and to prove to himself that Christianity was right, because he was getting very involved in this church, in order to prove to them that Christianity was right and deism was wrong, Miller decided to go through the whole Bible and go line by line, one at a time, and contemplate every single line in the Bible until he fully understood and comprehended its meaning. Interesting. Where have we heard that before? Miller became obsessed with the second coming of Jesus, and he used something called like the year-to-day method. Mm-hmm. I'd never heard of this before, but the year-to-day method is a method in which the Bible says something happens in a day, and that means that thing happens over the course of a year. So he used this method to try to determine the second coming of Jesus, and he thought that it would happen in 1843.
So this comes from a scripture in the sequels, as you would say. 2 Peter 3:8 says that 1 day is with the Lord is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is 1 day. So statements like that are what lead to when scripture says something is a particular amount of time, like 1 day, 1 week, or 1 year, believing that it is literally a specific amount of time, but that if it says 1 day, it could mean 1 year, or if it says 1,000 days, it could mean 1,000 years, or whatever. Do you remember talking about creationism and gap theory?
Yes.
One way of reconciling creationism without the young earth is to think of each day of the creation narrative as 1,000 years, or even as a much longer period of time, like an era or an epoch. This is why you'll hear young earth creationists specify God created the earth in 7 literal days. They are clarifying that they do not believe in gap theory or that God created the earth over 7 eras of time.
Gap theory was something that was actually first explained to me by, I think it was an Episcopalian minister, like 3.5 years ago when I was in a clubhouse room, and I thought it was interesting. I just kind of want to say that I think it's nice to see people looking for workarounds in their religious beliefs that make them compatible with like science and real life, rather than using workarounds for their religious beliefs to make them work with their other religious beliefs. No, I do think that the 1 day with the Lord is 1,000 years and 1,000 years is a day is something that you can only really use if you're trying to be biblical. I don't want to say you can only really use it if you're trying to be biblically literalist, but it's a biblically literalist way to not make yourself be biblically literalist about everything. Which is kind of funny.
Yeah. This is something that can be applied outside of prophecy, like I was mentioning with creationism, but it most often gets applied to prophecy, and most specifically Daniel's week's prophecy, where each week represents a 7-year period, and there is a long gap between the first 49 weeks and the last 50th week, which is the 7 years of the tribulation. We did not even get into Daniel during this whole series.
Yeah, we did. We talked about Daniel.
Barely.
In the first one with the Gundam.
Yeah, but barely.
Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Yeah. Anyway, William Miller, was preaching, he was gaining followers, and he was telling his followers that the second coming of Jesus was going to happen in 1843. This, in fact, did not happen. So he then revised his calculations to take into account the Hebrew calendar and determined that the second advent would, he predicted like 2 or 3 other times, I think, but he predicted that the second advent would occur on October 22nd, 1844. And so Miller and his followers, of which there were something like 50 or 100,000 at this point, by some estimates. So it was not a small religious movement. It was a very large religious movement. There were 50 or 100,000 people who were absolutely expecting Jesus to return and for something to happen, possibly a cleansing of the earth by fire. And October 22nd, 1844 came and went and nothing happened. And this was known as the Great Disappointment. Following the Great Disappointment, the Millerites kind of fractured and turned into different sects based on what they thought was the reason for none of Miller's predictions coming true. Now, for those keen-eared among our listeners, you may notice that Miller used the word Advent to refer to the second coming of Jesus. And so, Adventism sort of became the catch-all term to refer to all of the Millerist sects who had branched off from one another following the Great Disappointment. The most prominent of the Adventist denominations is the Seventh-day Adventist Church, of which there have also been many offshoots over the years, including the Branch Davidians, who were led by David Koresh, who holed up in Waco when they were besieged by the ATF, and we did an episode about them about 2.5 years ago, I think. That being said, when I was reading about Millerism, what I didn't find was the belief that there would be a big trumpet sound and that all of the believers would be zoomed up to heaven. The belief in Jesus returning to cleanse the world in fire and a rapture zooming everyone up into heaven, these beliefs sort of both became prominent in the 1830s. So I was looking at where like the rapture idea came from. And I was able to trace it back to John Nelson Darby, who Sadie described earlier as the man who also mainstreamed dispensationalism.
Oh, so Darby did the Rapture too.
Yes.
Okay.
So Darby was one of the founding members of the Plymouth Brethren, which was a sort of church group, kind of semi-charismatic sect of Christianity that had members in England and Ireland. In 1827, Darby put together his theory of pre-tribulationism, which was also the first time that the idea that all of the saved people would be zoomed up to heaven was first synthesized and put forward as like, oh, this is my theological theory. There had been like fringe things in the past, but this was the first time it was like, no, we are a group of people and this is what we believe. So if you're wondering why the pre-tribulation rapture is kind of the belief that's most represented in people who do believe in a literal rapture, it's because the rapture belief itself originated with the theory of pre-tribulationism. And I always assumed it was the other way around, that the rapture was part of Christian canon and that people were in disagreement about when it would occur, that like the rapture was something that was actually talked about in the Bible in explicit terms. And then people were like arguing over the details of it. But no, what I see now is that the pre-tribulation rapture was introduced first and then got kind of like absorbed into mainstream evangelicalism. And then it became sort of part of the furniture. And so when you say, actually, the Bible supports mid-trib or post-trib rapture, you're the weird one, even though that is more scripturally accurate.
Mm-hmm.
So pre-trib rapture and dispensationalism were literally created by the same guy. And I'm just totally kind of like mind blown when I hear about this. So if you all out there, the ones of you that have rapture trauma, you can blame John Nelson Darby. He is the one who is to blame for everything.
The pre-tribulation rapture became a part of the belief because the rapture and pre-tribulationism were tied to each other. Christianity always believed that Jesus was gonna come back for his people, but that is most historically tied with the second coming, which is the thing that happens at the end of the tribulation. The rapture, where everybody gets zoomed up in the sky, is the part that is not so much a part of historical Christian tradition. So when the rapture and pre-tribulationism got introduced together, they tended to stick together. Darby, as you said, was Plymouth Brethren, and Miller started out as Baptist, but he's not part of the direct theological line leading to the IFB. So we know that dispensationalism and rapture theology became popular because of Darby and Anderson and Miller. But I was wondering if there was a way to trace why these things are so essential to IFB thinking in particular.
That's sort of what I was thinking as well. And this is a little bit of an aside, but I do think it's interesting that Millerism and pre-tribulationism came out around the same time. I also think it's interesting that this was just within a few years of the start of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And this idea of literally interpreting scripture, that the commandments to the Israelites being commandments to you personally, came about at the same time as Mormonism. So when God tells the Israelites, go forth and get all the land, you have people interpreting that, meaning this is a commandment to America. So you have Joseph Smith saying that Jesus came to America as the same as he came to Judea. And so they are moving west to embody manifest destiny. And at the same time, you have these IFB Baptist beliefs that America is mentioned in the book of Revelation and first taking shape here. Like, I can't help but notice that these two things kind of rhyme a little bit, like the manifest destiny,
It is kind of incredible how the IFB hate the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the J-Dubs and the SDAs, like, almost more than they hate any other religious groups. And then when you look into it, the IFB share a lot theologically with those religious groups, especially the SDAs.
Like, the more I've been reading about Seventh-day Adventism, the more similarities that I see. Like, when we were studying David Koresh and the Branch Davidians, I listened to probably dozens of recordings of David Koresh speaking. All of the recordings that people that are out there that people have access to, I pretty much listened to them. And there were entire like passages, blocks, and illustrations that he would use that I don't know if they could have come out of the mouth of Jack Hyles, but I think they could have come out of the mouth of a Lester Roloff or a J. Frank Norris, because Jack Hyles was maybe a little more reserved than those guys.
Yeah, or what you've heard of Hyles, because you have heard a lot of his Sunday morning or pastor school type sermons.
No, I heard the Fire and Brimstone light. I didn't get the Muy Caliente Fire and Brimstone.
So this does explain, I know we have a lot of former members of denominations like Jehovah's Witnesses or Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that listen to our show because the purity culture was so similar, because the rules culture was so similar, and they can identify really strongly with XIFB on those things. And it is starting to make more sense when I look at the founding of those religions.
The DNA is definitely there.
Yeah. But how did the specific rapture and revelation beliefs become essential for the IFB? Because in the modern IFB, these beliefs are absolutely non-negotiable, essential beliefs. You will see it on church websites stating that we are a premillennial, pre-tribulationist, revelation-believing church. It is very, very important to the IFB, to the point that they will split with other churches over it. So I was wondering if I could make a theory on how those things got so strongly connected.
Oh, go for it.
Well, I was reading about the spread of dispensationalism, and the Scofield Reference Bible kept coming up as being credited with spreading dispensationalism to America. For those who don't know, the Scofield Reference Bible is an annotated study Bible, very popular to this day with fundamentalists. Many to most IFB preachers use a Scofield Reference Bible. It was published in the United States for the first time around the same time as the Fundamentals. I had never really looked into why specifically the Scofield Reference Bible was so popular with fundamentalists before. But now that I looked into it, it seems like the popularity of the Scofield Reference Bible and the popularity of the Fundamentals went hand in hand. These two texts were recommended together, used together, cross-referenced each other, and all of a sudden my life started to make sense.
I find it just so interesting that there are all of these peripheral texts, like the Schofield Reference Bible or the Fundamentals, or just there are ideas that get held onto because they're in tradition, and then they get sort of absorbed as if they're a secondary canon, just like the John the Apostle, John of Patmos being the same guy.
Yeah, and the boiling in oil and all that.
I also find it interesting because premillennialism is a very common held belief within the Southern Baptist Convention. And the Southern Baptist Convention originally separated from the Triennial Baptist Convention over the issue of slavery in 1845. But the Triennial Convention goes all the way back to 1815. And so that predates premillennialism by many years. So I'm wondering exactly how this belief got absorbed into the Southern Baptist Convention as well. And I assume that it must just be some sort of mainstream theological teaching that had this backpacking on top of it.
Yeah, and that teaching is the Fundamentals. The series of essays that were published in the early 1900s defining what this group of authors believed to be the fundamentals of the Christian faith. Remember, fundamentalism as a movement, the very early 1900s, the movement that rose to define the basics of Christianity and combat higher criticism, was not just the IFB. Far from it. Fundamentalism in these early years included people from many, many different traditions. Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Methodists, Baptists, more. I looked back at the title list for the 90 essays published in the Fundamentals, as I do frequently. I have a page bookmarked for it. The first new thing that I noticed this time is that there was a female author of the Fundamentals, which I have never noticed before. Her name was Mrs. Jessie Penn Lewis.
Are you saying that Jack Scott got his theology from a woman?
Yes.
Nice.
And she's now on our episode list because I need to know more about her. But as we know, most of the essays in the Fundamentals were about things like biblical inerrancy, the personhood and deity of Jesus, the virgin birth, how salvation works, how atonement works, and how higher criticism is bad. The Fundamentals also went on some side quests, including why Mormons are bad, why Christian Science is bad, why evolution is bad, why Catholics are bad, and in one essay, premillennialism.
Interesting.
Yeah, there's an essay about premillennialism in the Fundamentals, and I read it. And if you're a big theology nerd like me, I actually suggest you go find it in my sources and read this. It's not very long. The essay is called The Coming of Christ by Dr. Charles R. Erdman. This essay argues very eloquently for the literal, imminent, premillennial return of Jesus. Interestingly, it does not advocate for a pre-tribulation rapture because it does not mention the rapture as something that can be separated from the literal, imminent, premillennial second coming of Jesus.
So the believers going up to heaven is the thing that happens when Jesus comes back.
Right, which is the thing that happens probably at the end of the tribulation, but definitely before the millennium.
So it's not like ba ba da ba 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 and then everyone's gone.
Right.
You're going to know Jesus is back. There's going to be an announcement or something.
Mm-hmm. Jesus is here. He is going to defeat this Satan and the Antichrist and the false prophet, and it will usher in 1,000-year reign of Jesus on earth. At the end of that time, the devil will be loosed, get one more chance to get the people. Jesus wins again, and we all live happily ever after. The rapture, as a separate event in that chronology, is just not a thing. In this essay that's included in the Fundamentals, it doesn't say the rapture and the second coming are the same thing, but it doesn't differentiate them. It doesn't separate them by 7 years like the pre-trib rapture beliefs would do now. In fact, this article does not address a literal 7-year tribulation as something separate from the general sinful and painful state of the world now as Christians wait for Jesus to return. This essay supports a literal rapture, literal return of Christ, literal millennium, but not so much literal tribulation or pre-trib rapture. I read a little bit into Charles Erdman, who wrote this essay, and he was originally a pre-tribulationist, but later recanted that belief upon further study. I was not able to pin down whether this essay was written when he was a pre-tribulationist, but he didn't mention it in the essay, or if he wrote this essay later in his life when he had changed that belief.
Right, because it makes sense that if you are believing in the imminent return of Jesus to earth, you could just believe, well, everything, all of the, life is pain, life is calamity, life is hardship.
Yes.
We, like, all of these things that have been described are things that are going on and have been going on the entire time that man has been here since the fall of man.
Yeah, wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes and natural disasters, those are just things that happen.
Famine, demagogues, all of those things.
Famine, death, crazy leaders who make financial rules that you don't like, the devil trying to get Jesus, and like all of that is just kind of what's been going on ever since.
And Jesus will come back and rescue us from all of those things happening imminently sometime.
So the blessed hope, you'll hear Christians refer to the blessed hope, and in modern and evangelical and rapture believing circles, people will now call the rapture the blessed hope. But I don't think that was ever supposed to be. I think the blessed hope was always supposed to be when Jesus comes back, the second coming, which is a different thing from the rapture. This is actually a pretty orthodox Christian belief. Interpretations of Revelation have varied wildly throughout the millennia, but the general idea of Jesus is coming back for his people is the through line in Christianity. However, tying the second coming to Revelation, or a particular moment in the book of Revelations, to Thessalonians, and tying that to the rapture and a literal 7-year tribulation followed by a 1,000-year millennium, and all of it being so literal and so scheduled, is what is newer and less orthodox in terms of how many centuries Christians have tended to believe this.
I've asked Christian friends about, do you believe that Jesus is coming back for us? And for us, I don't know. So I sometimes put that in there to say if they'll include me in the people that he's coming back for or not, which is, you get some different responses to that. But like I'm
not sure what answer you want to that.
That's how, like, if I say, is Jesus coming back for us? If they're universalists, they'll say, well, yeah, Jesus is coming back for everyone. But like, I've had people that will say Jesus will literally come back to earth. I've also had people say to me, well, Jesus did come back for us and he's still with us.
A new belief that I was exposed to while researching this episode was the idea that the appearance of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost was Jesus coming back.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
And that's something that happened very shortly after the crucifixion, the resurrection, and Jesus's assumption into heaven. So the idea is that the Holy Spirit is the return of Jesus. The idea that Jesus did come back for us and is still with us, whether you look at that from a preterist or historicist perspective, or you look at the Holy Spirit as that manifestation of Jesus, that all can still fit within a fairly orthodox Christian system of belief. And it can also work with amillennialism. It can also work with postmillennialism. Even the idea of Jesus is coming back one day to defeat sin and evil and harm forever, and everything will be perfect. But today is not that day, so we need to be good people and try to make the world a better place. All of that can fit into different historical Christian ideas about the end and the second coming. It's been pretty diverse, actually, throughout church history, like more so than you might think. So we had Darby, who influenced Miller, and then Schofield, who helped spread ideas similar to Miller's ideas and Darby's ideas. And then you have Robert Anderson, who was friends with Darby, who was a writer in the Fundamentals, which is also connected to premillennialism and the general idea of the rapture. it all ties back to the fundamentals somehow. I also found out that well-known fundamentalist preacher D.L. Moody, who is credited with having invented the idea of the bus ministry before buses were even invented. He was doing it with horse-drawn carriages in Chicago. Moody also preached about the rapture all around the country in the late 1800s and early 1900s, just a couple decades before the fundamentals came out. And you have Clarence Larkin. Larkin made the quote-unquote official timeline of dispensationalism and premillennial pre-trib rapture that is still taught at Hyles-Anderson College last time I checked. He first published that official timeline as a specific defense of Scofield and Darby in 1919, a couple years after the fundamentals were first published. What I'm trying to say is it all goes together because all of these guys were buddies and they were all working together on creating a systemic theology. It was a movement, and the movement toward fundamentalism is not exactly the same as the movement toward premillennial pre-trib rapture dispensationalism, but the Venn diagram is almost a circle. It's not quite a circle, but it's almost a circle.
That is so interesting, though, because those are all people that, like, the IFB reveres these people. The IFB reveres, anybody who came up with a piece of theology that they used, or, a technique that they used for saving people or for converting people. And they view themselves as the successor to those. So that makes so much sense as to why the ideas specifically that those people were teaching are the ideas that ended up in IFB theology. That's so interesting.
Because the IFB grew directly out of the original fundamentalist movement. The IFB is birthed through J. Frank Norris and then later Jack Hyles. That's the genealogy of the modern IFB. It has to come through those men or somebody who is associated with them or somebody who is a rival to them. And J. Frank Norris came through the path of the fundamentals, but broke that movement off into something smaller, which is the IFB. And the people who were involved in the fundamentalist movement, some of whom later gave birth to the IFB, were also involved in the pre-trib, premillennial dispensationalist movement a couple years before the fundamentals came out. There we go. I did it.
That's so interesting.
So it's not like, I think there's this really big temptation for, if dare I say, historians like myself, to look for a direct cause and effect on stuff like this, because I can be a very literal person and I can desire to find this is exactly how. This is a letter between Darby and Scofield where Darby convinced Scofield of this particular view, and then Scofield passed it on to this particular guy who influenced J. Frank Norris. I want to have the exact through line, and you don't often get that with theology.
But this is so close to that.
But this is really close, and I'm pretty happy with it.
I can hear like the satisfied like click in your brain. It's like it's like, when you just like stretch and your sternum pops.
Yes.
That's what I'm hearing in your voice right now.
Yeah. I mean, this is, I feel very satisfied.
Yeah.
The final thing I want to loop into this is the idea of biblical literalism. Biblical literalism is the foundation of the fundamentalist movement, because the fundamentalist movement came into being to fight higher criticism, which is the opposite of biblical literalism. The literalist futurist view of a pre-trib rapture, 7-year tribulation, Antichrist, Armageddon, and millennium is not just dependent on strict biblical literalism. It's not based on what I would call one-to-one biblical literalism, what it says on the can, biblical literalism. Because the rapture, if the rapture is mentioned in Revelation, it would have to be mid-trib or post-trib. The pre-trib rapture view from Revelation is very weak. So how do we get people who believe that the rapture is not just part of literal revelation prophecy, but a specific part of pre-tribulation literal revelation prophecy. Well, to explain that, in this fundamentalist, hyper-literalist way of thinking, it doesn't matter that the rapture was mentioned in 1 Thessalonians, and then the specific prophecy on the timing of the man of sin, the Antichrist, was in 2 Thessalonians, and those things aren't in Revelation, but we have to fit those things into the Revelation timeline. And the reason it doesn't matter is because the author of all of those prophecies is God, and it's a predetermined conclusion that all parts of the Bible will fit together seamlessly because of this specific type of fundamentalist biblical literalism.
That is such a workaround, though. It's almost like it doesn't matter if Paul is saying some nonsense because God knows that you're the one who's reading the book now and you're the one who has all the information to put the pieces together. Like, God knew that the early disciples wouldn't have the full picture. So they just have what they needed in order to follow Jesus and to write the books that they wrote about Jesus. And now we can see this all from a distance and we have the whole picture. And so the other thing that this does is it radically shifts the purpose of Scripture. Like the Israelites and the Judeans and all the disciples, none of them had the full Bible because they were living it. But you have the full Bible, which means that God intended for you to have all of this information now, and he wouldn't have intended for you to have all of this information if you weren't going to need all of it. And it also does something interesting where it puts the reader in the story as part of the story. Mm-hmm. So you feel like the onus is on you to do the next thing. Right. Which is bring about the next thing that's supposed to happen in the story.
And that is what I personally call hyper-literalism. In honor of my dad and his love of calling things that he didn't like hyper-Calvinism, hyper-dispensationalism, etc. What I personally call hyper-literalism is the idea that not only is the Bible true and literal historical account of what happened, but that any command or phrase or prayer in the Bible can at any time be personally applied to the reader or to a group of readers. In my opinion, the fundamentalist literalist idea of Revelation, the version that's portrayed in Left Behind and Thief in the Night, and so many other works of Rapture fan fiction, depends on this type of literalism that I would call hyper-literalism. It is taking the Bible more literally than the text seems to indicate you should take it. Okay. I just said the word literalism and dispensationalism a lot. Let's take up the offering. And when we come back, I want to talk about what the early church believed about Revelation. Hey, Sadie here. If this is your first time listening to the Leaving Eden podcast, make sure you go back and check out episode 57. It's a primer episode for new listeners. That episode tells my personal story and gives you all the terms and information that you'll need to know going forward. Also, check out our cult true crime series, The First Family of Fundamentalism, so that you can get the whole cult story. If you like our show, you can support us by joining our Patreon, where we have extended and uncensored episodes as well as other bonus content available. You can also join in the discussion in our Facebook group. That group is called Eden Exodus. Tell a friend, tell a family member, tell your worst enemy. The Leaving Eden podcast is a fully independent podcast, and we really appreciate your support. Now, back to the show.
So we are back from our break. We're talking about, so if this belief in the rapture and this very literalist belief of the book of Revelation didn't exist until the 19th century, essentially, what did the early church believe?
I was specifically curious about the people who heard Jesus say that this generation would not pass away until his prophecy had come true. The people who lived actual persecution. The people who were receiving letters from Paul and Peter. The people who lived through the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD. Or their children or their grandchildren. The people who, a generation or two later after that, who maybe never met the apostles, but their parents did or their grandparents did and told them stories about having personally met the apostles. What about early church members in the year 100 CE or 200 CE? They wouldn't have known any of the original apostles themselves, but there was a recent family memory of them. This made me think of my dad's Bear Bryant hat. I promise this is going to make sense. It's been a while since I did an extended analogy corner. If you know anything about Bear Bryant, the famous Alabama football coach, he was known for wearing iconic black and white houndstooth hats while coaching football games. My great-grandfather, my paternal grandmother's dad, so my dad's mom's dad, went to an Alabama practice one day in the 60s or 70s, and he ended up on the sideline standing next to the great coach, Bear Bryant. My great-grandfather struck up a conversation with Coach Bryant, and in that conversation, he ended up complimenting his hat. Coach Bryant asked my great-grandpa, well, what hat size are you? And it turned out that they were the same hat size. So Coach Bryant took off his hat and gave it to my great-grandpa on that day back sometime in the 60s or 70s. So that hat came into our family when my dad was just a kid. And it was passed down to him when his grandfather died when he was a young adult. And it is now going to stay in the family now that my dad has passed on. It's an heirloom that Chuck will be able to see and touch one day. Putting this in historical context, Bear Bryant died 10 years before I was born. So 38 years before Chuck was born. But she will be able, and then my dad died when she was less than a year old. But she will be able to see this thing that belonged to her grandpa, who she met but won't remember, and belonged to her great-great-grandpa, who died 38 years before she was born. My great-grandfather, Chuck's great-great-grandfather, was born in 1897, so very close to 100 years before me. That's 96 years before me. 90, yeah. And Bear Bryant was born in 1913, which is 80 years before me. So we have already far surpassed 100 years since either one of those people were born. And the hat will almost certainly still be in the family 100 years after the death of Bear Bryant, which would be coming up on 200 years since the birth of Bear Bryant. So all that to say, people tend to calculate that Jesus was born around 4 BC and that the crucifixion happened around 29 or 30 CE. And we know that the destruction of the temple happened in 70 CE. So to me, it's totally plausible that somebody who was alive in, I don't know, let's say 170 CE, 140 years after Jesus died, could have a belonging or even a manuscript that was directly from Paul or Peter or Luke or John. That person's great-grandfather could have met or eaten with or lived with one of the apostles. When you think about, I can't remember his name, the kid who fell out the window while Paul was preaching. Some people are screaming it at their podcast listening devices now. But that kid was like 15 during the ministry of Paul, which could have been around 45, 50 CE. So that kid could have been born around 35-ish CE. So if he lived a really long life and then had kids, he could have still been alive in 100 CE. It's totally plausible. And when we're talking about early church, that kind of first few generations that did not ever meet Jesus, did not ever personally meet one of the apostles, but it's in recent memory, it's in living memory. They would have known a family member who did, or they could have had a belonging that belonged to them. With that in mind, let's talk about Origen. Origen was born in Alexandria to Christian parents in the year 185 CE. This is an early church father who would have been born between the 100-year mark of the destruction of the temple and the 100-year mark of the book of Revelation being written. His father, St. Leonidas of Alexandria, was martyred in 202 CE, according to Eusebius, a historian and theologian who we're going to get to in a second. Church tradition holds that the Apostle Mark, author of the book of Mark, went to Alexandria around 49 CE and was martyred there. So thinking about that 100-year framework, Leonidas wasn't old enough to have met Mark, but Mark's death and Leonidas' birth were not that far apart. Less than 100 years apart. It's totally plausible that maybe somebody who Mark mentored or spoke to when they were a child ended up influencing Leonidas. Now, that's all completely hypothetical. It's just a guess. What I'm trying to do is not draw a direct line from the Apostle Mark to Origen. What I'm trying to do is illustrate exactly what point of church history we are at when we talk about things that happened in 200 CE. Origen was one of the most prolific early church writers, philosophers, and theologians. He was potentially among the most educated people in the world at his time, and some early Christian churches would ship him in from Alexandria to wherever they were to help them sort out like who was a heretic or not. He was, you could maybe describe him as a judge of the early Christian church. Origen was hugely influential on early church beliefs. It's important to note, however, that some of my information about Origen comes from a website called preteristcentral.com. So while everything seemed to check out with the quotes they gave from Origen, and I did try to check as much as I could, that is obviously a biased source. So as a young writer, Origen was a futurist and also a universalist. His views on Revelation changed drastically throughout his life, and by the end of his life, Origen was an orthodox partial preterist. He believed that the prophecy of Jesus in the Olivet Discourse and the prophecy in Revelation had all come to pass roughly 115 years before his birth, and that the only prophecy left to be fulfilled was that Jesus would return, judge the living and the dead, and set up his millennial kingdom on earth. One more side note. The Wikipedia page for preterism says that it was, quote, first expounded by Jesuit Luis de Alcazar during the Counter-Reformation. I don't think that's correct or at the very least, it's misleading because it makes it seem like de Alcazar was the inventor of this rather than someone who led one resurgence of it. Preterism was not, by far, the only view of Revelation and end times among the early church, and I am not claiming that it was. What I do think is that preterism was one orthodox view of Revelation, among others.
And it was also clearly institutionally ingrained in such a manner that one of the most prominent clergy in the early days of the church believed in it as a theory.
I think the way that maybe I would phrase that is it was on the table. Let's go to Eusebius, and then we're going to come back to that phrase on the table because I think I can explain why I use that exact phrase. Eusebius was a direct philosophical descendant of Origen through Pamphilus. Eusebius was the bishop of Caesarea in the time of the Council of Nicaea, which is a pretty freaking important time in church history. The Council of Nicaea is the one that sorted out a lot of beliefs about the Trinity. In the Council of Nicaea was the church council that struck down the belief Arianism, not white supremacy Arianism, Arianism. Arius was the guy who came up with Arianism. Arianism teaches in part that Jesus is subordinate to God the Father. It's something the early church had to really argue about hardcore, exactly who are the parts of God and what is a Trinity and who the heck is in charge up there. Arius's idea of a God hierarchy fell into disfavor at the Council of Nicaea, which struck down Arianism and birthed the Nicene Creed. But Arius's ideas were probably influenced by Origen's early writings, so it makes sense that Eusebius, as a philosophical descendant of Origen, also tended toward Arianism. But the conclusion is, a lot of things were on the table. At this point in church history, people were trying to figure out or codify what is a Trinity, what is Scripture, what is canon. Was Jesus human or God or what? I've talked about the hypostatic union and theorizing what is a Jesus? How did that work? A lot of things were on the table. But what I think I can and have proved is that preterism is one of several orthodox views about Revelation and end times that was on the table at the time of the early church. Interestingly enough, Origen was also strongly amillennial, and more than any other person is the reason that the Catholic Church still does not profess a literal millennium. I read an article from newadvent.org, which publishes online a 1917 Catholic encyclopedia. And that article from the 1917 Catholic Encyclopedia said that the idea of a literal millennium was influenced by Jewish ideas of a literal Messiah, especially around the time that Jesus lived. And I feel like we've talked about this before. Like, messianic beliefs were pretty literal in that era of Second Temple Judaism, right?
Yeah.
The article in the Catholic Encyclopedia argued that people who were futurists and believed in a literal millennium were more likely to be people who converted from Judaism to Christianity, early Christianity, in like literally the first 100, 200 years of Christianity being a thing. But Origen, that wasn't him. He was from Alexandria. He grew up with Greek ideas, and his family had converted to Christianity from non-Jewish religion, and that may be what influenced him to not believe in a literal millennium.
That's so interesting.
That strikes me as a pretty good theory. And you can see that in writings of early church fathers if you know what their background was before Christianity, or what their family or culture background was before Christianity. So Origen did not believe in a literal millennium. He believed that the church age is the millennium. It's not going to literally be exactly 1,000 years. Like right now, we're still in the millennium. We're in the church age. And still to come at some point in the future is the second coming and the final judgment of the living and the dead.
I just think it's so odd. The IFB have such an affinity for the early days of the church, and that they trace their spiritual lineage back through, you know, the Anabaptists, the Martyrs, Trail of Blood, what have you, back to people who probably would have been either influenced by Origen or contemporaries of Origen, yet they strongly oppose ideas of universalism. I mean, they're strongly futurist, and they consider beliefs that are not theirs to be pretty much heresy, when even in the days of the early church, there was no real consensus.
And the IFB want to portray that real Christian theology has never changed, that their specific theology can be traced back to the early church. I just don't think that's accurate. The IFB would not want to say that they got any theology from Origen, because they see Origen as one of those Catholics. Never mind the fact that Origen died several hundred years before the Catholic Church really became a thing. Even though that's also ridiculous, even if Origen was Catholic, because they're wanting to be an apostolic faith. The IFB, because of through the whole Trail of Blood, they want to usurp the Catholic Church's apostolic tradition. But there is plenty reason, as I have laid out, to think that Origen was a direct spiritual descendant of St. Mark. It doesn't get much more apostolic than a literal apostle who was one of the 4 gospel writers.
I don't know, maybe it's kind of like, you know, I like Led Zeppelin, but I think Greta Van Fleet is a knockoff version.
Sure.
Like, why would you go for a tribute act when you could have the original? When you have the words themselves to interpret, then you don't need them filtered through somebody else's interpretation, unless, of course, that is the fundamentals of the Christian faith or the Schofield Reference Bible. But
it goes back to biblical literalism, right? And speaking out against higher criticism. Listen, if you believe that the specific English translation of the Bible that you hold in your hands is 100% perfect and just as good as if God had originally spoken his words to the writers in English, then you don't need what Origen thought about St. Mark. You don't even really need what St. Mark thought about anything, because you believe you have the perfect words of God penned by St. Mark. Doesn't matter what Mark thought, doesn't matter what Origen thought, doesn't matter what anybody else thought. You have the perfect words of God in your hand, and you are the qualified interpreter.
Well, that same argument could be used to say, I don't need to follow what the preacher tells me to do because I have the literal words of God in my hand. And if the preacher tells me to do something, well, the preacher isn't God. I have the words of God in my hand. But
some people do try that, and then they get proof texted with a lot of verses about how if you don't do what the preacher says, 40 bears will eat you.
Forgot about that one.
Yeah. So, so backing up a little, we've learned that the early church had a variety of views on the end times, but that amillennial preterism and post-tribulation rapture, premillennial futurism were both pretty common. Talking about the first 300 to 400 years of Christianity, extremely early church fathers differed wildly on their views of what exactly the tribulation was and when it happened, or whether it was currently happening or whether it had already happened 100 years ago. They were trying to hammer out the Trinity, so they had bigger fish to fry, and they did argue over this interpretation of Revelation. They argued about whether Revelation should be canon, but it wasn't the biggest thing on their plate. So it seems like that was more of a side quest for the very early church.
Yeah, I do find it interesting, though, that these people were, I think, much more reasonably in the time frame of this generation shall not pass, and they weren't worried about the details of this. While now, over 1,000 years later, this is like the most pressing issue that anybody can ever devote their time to studying.
Then, thousands of years later, looking at the decades leading up to the fundamentalist movement, specifically the fundamentalist movement as it pertains to the United States and as it pertains to the IFB being an offshoot movement of the fundamentalist movement, premillennialism was popular. It was tied to the growth of fundamentalism, and specific rapture teachings were also popular. I kind of see fundamentalism and premillennial pre-trib rapture as separate and independent, but growing side by side. And eventually premillennialism becoming standard in American evangelicalism because of the fundamentals, and pre-trib rapture just plain being popular. I might even say trendy. People like pre-trib rapture. Oh, the Theo Bros are not going to like this episode. But the idea of absolute biblical literalism, which was the very foundation of fundamentalism, demanded that all beliefs be sure and settled and found directly in Scripture. So I think people went looking for a pre-trib rapture in Scripture, and then they kind of sort of found it in Revelation chapter 4. I think people just wanted it to be pre-trib rapture because people just like pre-trib rapture, because it has a lot of benefits if you believe that you're one of the people going up.
Yeah, and I do think that like the self-righteousness is its own, kind of becomes its own reward in the minds of people who
there is a little bit more about how Revelation became canon. I think the point I want to make is that Revelation has always been debated. Always. Debating about it now is nothing new. The IFB aren't special. They're just late to the party.
Thing I kind of almost feel about this is that now that you brought up that like the Revelation was trendy, that explains so much of the IFB, that they grabbed onto something that was popular at the time and then they never let it go. And so now it's like you see somebody now rocking a trend that was a trend like 30 or 40 years ago, and it looks really off religious. You know what I'm saying?
Uh-huh.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I mean, it is kind of like the rest of the IFB, where you see them dressed like it's 1987 and they're like, well, our standards never changed. Nothing ever changed. The theology has never changed, but they grabbed onto a theological idea that was just trendy at the time and decided that it was the original idea.
Right. And then retconned it to try to make it appear to be the original idea.
I remember when I was like 14, this was like right when Twilight came out. Like when the books were popular. I don't think the movies had been made yet. People were somebody was like talking about vampires and being like, actual vampires are blah, 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 this, that, and they were describing the vampires from Twilight. I'm like, whatever, because they're like shiny and not like Dracula. And I'm like, well, I didn't know that, but I guess that's true as part of the myth or the legend, and they've just been changed over time and evolved into something different. come to find out, no, that's just something that was trendy at the moment, and this person decided to retcon it back to being the original.
Yeah. Okay, no, I was wondering where you were going when you said Twilight, but that totally made sense.
Well, let's go take up our offering break. We're going to talk.
And we're going to come back and talk about psychedelics.
Hell yeah. We are back from our break. We talked about all of the exhausting and theological and historical aspects of it. Now it's time for us to talk about nonsense.
So I feel like throughout this series and in many modern discussions of the Book of Revelation, you will hear us and other commentators make jokes along the lines of, what psychedelics was John on when he wrote this?
Actually, though,
there's not proof that John took a specific substance before writing Revelation. There has been actual serious scholarship about it. And I would say it's within the realm of possibility. I sped read a book called The Psychedelic Gospels, The Secret History of Hallucinogens in Christianity by Jerry B. Brown and Julie M. Brown. And I was thinking that this book would convince me of their point. Unfortunately, they come off as Da Vinci Code fans, even though they do make a good, clear point about the insufficiency of Dan Brown's historical research and sociology skills. This husband and wife team is highly educated and traveled around the world looking for depictions of psychedelic plants in early Christian and other religious art. Now, the parts of their book I agree with. They found depictions of psychedelic plants in religious artwork. They felt that they found an image of an Amanita mushroom in the Rosslyn Chapel. Yes, that Rosslyn Chapel, which they went to because of the Da Vinci Code, which did get a little bit of an eye roll from me. Where they went from there is where I start to disagree. They theorized that maybe the early Christian church was founded on psychedelic use, and maybe Jesus was a shaman who was taught the ways of the mushroom during the missing years. And then maybe he had an apocalyptic vision while he was tripping, and then he came back and told people about what he saw while he was tripping, and that was called the Olivet Discourse. And that's where I was expecting to agree with more of this book than I did, but unfortunately that's where I have to get off this train.
I've heard these sorts of claims as well. I've heard people tell me that in the story of the Exodus, that when Moses saw the burning bush and when the Israelites were given the commandments at Mount Sinai, that there was some sort of psychedelic explanation for those, for like the things that people saw in those situations. Well, clearly they couldn't have actually seen. There must have been something else going on. Frankly, I find these claims to be borderline offensive, in that you're gonna believe that the book of Exodus is true and that the people escaped from Egypt, but where you draw the line is whether or not God spoke to them or whether or not they were tripping when they, like, that's kind of the thing. Like, if you're going to believe that they're legends or myths that got written down, that's fine. Like, whatever. The sort of, well, they were just mistaken because they were all tripping balls explanation just feels kind of pretentious, but like, pretentiousness is sort of par for the course whenever you're talking about psychedelic stuff.
Yeah. So the people I was reading on this topic were implying that maybe it's all true, but God spoke to people through psychedelic substances.
Oh, God.
Like even theorizing that maybe that's what the Bible meant when it says Holy Spirit. And that's not only the Browns, that is other sources that I was reading as well. A little bit of what the Browns said in their book is verifiable. One thing that I was able to fact check is that the Great Canterbury Psalter, a 13th century Bible likely commissioned by royalty, did contain multiple images of what certainly could be psychedelic mushrooms. And they aren't just in there as border decorations on the page. These mushrooms are shown interacting with biblical characters. There is a 13th century image of Adam and Eve eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and it does kind of look exactly like a psychedelic mushroom. The thing is that this doesn't prove anything. It's not evidence that the tree of knowledge of good and evil was actually a magic mushroom. or that our favorite Bible characters interacted with psychedelics on a regular basis, or that early Christianity was a psychedelic cult. The absolute basic premise of if you're looking for shrooms in medieval and early Christian art, you're gonna find them. And these things are somehow associated by some people. That premise is correct. So I thought I'd be convinced by that book, and I guess I'm happy to report that my critical thinking is still working because the book didn't didn't convince me of anything much. However, I have heard a lot of theories that there are at least 2 species of psychedelic plants on the island of Patmos, so I started looking into that. There is a very common rumor that I may have even spread at some point that psychedelic mushrooms still currently grow on Patmos, and I looked a good bit and I was just not able to get 100% confirmation on that rumor. Based on the climate and mushrooms that do grow on Patmos and neighboring islands, it's totally plausible, but I was not able to turn up actual proof. The only thing is that the morning glory plant, which technically can be a hallucinogen, does grow on Patmos as best as I can tell from my internet research.
How hallucinogenic is morning glory, though?
If you eat enough of it, apparently.
Okay.
I definitely feel the urge to stamp a myth busted sticker on this one. The verse about the little scroll does give me pause. The whole bit about it tastes sweet, but it will make your stomach bitter definitely sounds like something people say sometimes about psychedelic substances. It's definitely intriguing, but I kind of thought I would come out with at least circumstantial evidence that John was tripping balls, but I actually found a lot less evidence than I thought I would.
Growing up in Oregon and living in Oregon as a young adult, you meet a lot of people who are really into psychedelics. And by you meet a lot of people, you meet a lot of people who are really into psychedelics, and you meet a lot of people who being really into psychedelics becomes their entire personality trait. Like their primary personality trait is this guy likes doing acid and magic mushrooms. In my experience, there is a level of confirmation bias that people tend to have, along with like often erroneous beliefs about the benefits of psychedelics. People also tend to try to shoehorn psychedelics into places where they don't belong. For example, I think that if I went around like Oregon Country Fair and started telling people that Shakespeare wrote all of his plays while he was on a psychedelic drug that was a precursor to LSD or something, and that was popular in Elizabethan times, I could probably get like 80% of the people to believe me if I told them that. Even though that's literally something that I just made up right now. When I hear a theory that somebody has that's like, psychedelics are the method by which God delivered the Holy Scriptures, to me, that's giving Aaron Rodgers going on a podcast and saying that he puts DMT up his butt before he takes the field every time he plays football. That's like...
Did he say that?
No, but that's the type of thing he would say. If you're telling me that psychedelics are... You know what I'm saying? Like, if you're telling me that psychedelics are... Like, I've heard people say, oh, yeah, I was talking to God back there, man. Like, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, but if you're telling me that psychedelics are actually in the Bible and that Jesus... I do get kind of the same vibe from these people as Thomas Jefferson translating the Bible to take all the miracles out. Do you see what I'm saying?
How so?
When people are saying, oh, well, when Moses saw the burning bush, he wasn't seeing the burning bush. He was really tripping balls. Or when...
Oh, no, now I see it.
You see the connection that I'm making there? That's kind of the... When you were bringing up the Thomas Jefferson Bible earlier in the episode, I'm like, I know where we're going to talk about that later. That's the thing that really, like... To me, and so that's kind of how I see that. I don't know. For me, it's kind of like... If you want to have a religious text, have a religious text. If you don't want to have a religious text, then don't have a religious text. But don't try to change the religious text to make it so that it fits your conception of, like, you're like, religion is right and I want to believe in religion because that's how you be a moral person. But all of these things where it says there are miracles, clearly that's fake. So I'm going to take all that part out of it. That, to me, that just seems like, if you're going to commit, then commit. If you're not, then don't try to like do half measures and meet it halfway. That's kind of my take on things like that.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from. So I did not end up in the same place with Revelation that I thought I would.
What, did you think that it would be totally fake?
Yeah, I thought maybe I would get to a point where I found proof that there is not a literal rapture in Revelation. Or I would find, because I've evolved so much with my relationship to the verses in scripture that are used as LGBT clobber verses. Done my own study on those. I've read a bunch, and the way that I see them is they are prohibitions that are specifically related to the culture in which they were written. They don't apply to consensual sex or relationships in 2024. The principles of consent and harm-free behavior absolutely apply in 2024. But it's not meant to be interpreted now as a message about what genders of people can or cannot have sex or relationships with each other. The principles of consent and harm-free behavior stand. But it's not a literal direction about who can put what and where. And I thought I would get there with Revelation and have something that felt settled, like a good faith alternate interpretation for the rapture and the tribulation. This is the first time I've gone back and read the text of Revelation with an open mind. And I thought I would be at the end of this series saying, yeah, it's cool. The rapture is totally not real. Nothing to worry about. And for those who are still believers, now, if you're not a believer, more power to you. I hope you do not stay up late thinking about the rapture. I hope it is just a weight off your mind and you are at peace. I sincerely want that for everybody. Especially those who are former believers, former Christians. If you're a Christian now and you're kind of in that gray area with me of trying to reconcile science and progressive views with Christianity, the idea of a rapture is definitely in there. I think I'm going to stop worrying about a pre-trib rapture personally. And I think I'm going to stop worrying about a literal sequential 7-year tribulation as well. I think this didn't release me in the way I thought. This didn't give me freedom from these ideas in the way I thought it would. But it did give me some freedom. It did give me some peace. I don't think, when you read the text with an open mind, I don't think the tribulation is actually 7 years or the judgments are literal. I think it's very interesting to look at the judgments of the tribulation as all being things that can or will happen or have happened. They are consequences for human behavior. For example, wildfires that destroy houses are consequences of bad human behavior a large amount of the time. All of these things, these judgments that are described in the book of Revelation, are things that can happen and do happen and will continue to happen until the end of time. I think the presence of the timeless interludes in Revelation is one point of evidence for it not being a literal 7 years. And I think the strongest scriptural evidence is to see the second coming as synonymous with the rapture, something that happens at the end. I thought I would get to the end and say Revelation is totally made up. I'm 100% idealist. That's not actually where I landed. I feel like I don't know. I feel like Revelation is highly figurative and metaphorical. I think the timeline is not literal. I think I'm ready to let myself not believe in a literal timeline of it, or literal, this judgment happens, then the next judgment happens. I think the judgments are all similar to things that will really happen, but not literal and not sequential. I think the tribulation probably encompasses everything from the ascension until the return of Jesus. I think if Revelation is literal at all, as opposed to being completely metaphorical and figurative, if it's literal, we're in the tribulation now. And it's not going to get unnaturally or unpredictably worse. It's only going to get worse naturally and predictably. Or it's going to get better again, because the prediction is about a cycle of human behavior, not about one specific time frame. I think if God wanted us to, so let's let's jump into literalist brain together. If there is an actual God of the Bible, and Revelation is the Word of God, and the King James Bible is a accurate translation of the words of God in English, and God wanted us to get a message from the book of Revelation. I think if God wanted us to get a specific message about an exact sequence of events in a very particular timeline, it would be more clear. I think what we are, if you are thinking in literalist brain, if you are thinking from the position of somebody who believes in God and believes in Scripture and believes that Revelation is Scripture, you can look at the fantastical and metaphorical qualities of this book, and you can look at the mysteries around this book, and you can say, all right, well, what God wants me to know is that good wins in the end. What God wants me to know is that a bunch of bad shit happens, but God's got it. And that's just my opinion. So if you've been paying attention, in technical terms, I see value in both idealism and a little bit of historicism and a little bit of preterism, and my personal view would be a mix of all of those things. This is not where I thought I would end up with the text, but I feel like I've given myself something I really needed, and I hope that our listeners have gotten something that they needed out of it as well.
Thank you for that, and I hope that you guys enjoyed this episode, and I hope you guys enjoyed this series. Next week, we're going to be back. Can I announce our guest for next week or not?
Yeah, please do.
Okay, well, if you know Andrew Pledger from Surviving BJU, Beyond BJU, Andrew Pledger has recently come on to the scene with a podcast about his experiences there and has done a great job interviewing other people. We had a great conversation a couple weeks back. Great guest for Pride Month. We talk about personal history, things like that. It's a lot of fun. Really encourage you guys to tune into that episode. That's going to be out next week for our first Pride Month episode. If you like our show, if you can follow our show on social media at Leaving Eden Podcast. You can follow me on, I guess Instagram's the only place I'm really on, is at GAVRIELHACOHEN. Sadie, you want to plug your socials?
Yeah, you can follow me on Instagram and now Threads at Sadie Carpenter Music, and on TikTok at Sadie Carpenter 1.
Thank you guys so much for tuning in. You have a great day. Bye-bye.
But old rolling river of time, you've healed me in too many days. No regrets, no confusion, there'll be no pollution. I'm so thankful I've decided to change my ways. I'm so thankful I decided to change.